Right now, the world thinks it's watching an oil crisis unfold, and on the surface, it makes sense why. Because energy markets are all over the place, and governments across Europe and Asia are scrambling to hold emergency meetings, and all of the panic can be traced back to one place: the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow strip of water that provides the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. And every single day, roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through it, which makes it the single most important choke point on the planet. And the general consensus is pretty clear: if something goes wrong here, the global economy is totally fucked. But maybe that's just the story we're being told, and maybe it's only half the story, because the truth is there's a lot more going on here. Because the real story isn't just about what's happening, it's about who it's happening to. Because oil shocks don't hit the world equally, and they never have. Because while some economies get crushed, others quietly benefit, and that's what this story is really about. It's not a story about a crisis, it's about positioning. Because most people still think this plays out like it did 20 years ago, where instability in the Middle East leads to an oil shock, which eventually hits the US economy, and for a long time, this was true. Because 20 years ago, the United States was heavily dependent on foreign oil. In fact, roughly 60% of the total petroleum consumption was from imports. So when the global supply got disrupted, the impact was immediate. Prices spiked, inflation surged, and the economy hit pause. It was a clear, linear relationship. But that version of the world doesn't exist anymore, because over the past 2 decades, something changed. New drilling techniques unlocked massive shale reserves for the United States, and production boomed. And suddenly, the United States didn't just reduce its dependence on foreign oil, it flipped the entire script. Because if you fast forward to the present, the United States is the largest oil producer in the world, which means the old narrative, it's outdated. Because now, the United States isn't on the same side of the trade anymore. So now the question becomes, then who actually is exposed? And this is where you get to the real story. Because most of the oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz isn't going to the United States. In fact, only 2.5% of it is. The majority of the oil in the Middle East is going somewhere else, to Asia, and more specifically, China, India, Japan, and South Korea. Because together, these 4 countries account for roughly 75% of all the oil moving through the strait. So when people say a disruption here will shock the global economy, they're not wrong, but they're also missing something very important. It's an asymmetric shock, and it doesn't hit everyone equally. Because for the United States, a disruption mostly just becomes a price problem, and that's because oil is globally priced. So if supply tightens anywhere, oil prices rise all over, which hurts, but it's at least manageable. But for Asia, it's different. Because it isn't just a price problem, it also becomes a supply problem, and those are very different things. Because higher prices slow you down, but losing access to your energy supply, well, that's when things can start to break. Where factories slow, energy gets rationed and production stalls. It's the same event, but with completely different consequences. And this is where the story shifts from crisis to positioning. Because when supply tightens and prices rise, it creates winners and losers. And right now, the United States is on the winning side, because higher prices don't just hurt, it also generates revenue, for producers, for exporters, and for energy companies. And the United States just happens to be the world's largest oil producer, which means the same shock that's creating global pain is also stimulating parts of the US economy. But oil is also only half the story, because there's a second layer that most people are completely overlooking: natural gas. Because the Middle East is also one of the largest exporters of liquefied natural gas in the world, and just like oil, a massive portion of it flows through the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, it's roughly 20% of the global supply of liquefied natural gas, and countries like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates send over 90% of their liquefied natural gas exports through the strait. So if the strait gets disrupted, it's not just the oil markets that tighten, it's gas markets too. And once again, this is where the United States shows up, because over the past decade, the United States has quietly become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, which means the same dynamic repeats. One region loses supply and another steps in to sell it. And the markets are already beginning to react to this, which is why we're seeing energy companies rise and exporters benefit. Venture Global, one of the fastest growing LNG exporters, has seen its stock jump nearly 40% in the past month. And Cheniere Energy, the largest LNG exporter in the US, is up nearly 15%. And on the crude oil side, we're seeing the same thing. And that's because scarcity doesn't just create risk, it creates opportunity. And here's the thing, bottlenecks don't just exist in oil markets, they exist in technology too. Because right now we don't have a shortage of AI tools. We have the opposite problem: too many models and too many options, and no clear answer on which one you're actually supposed to be using. Which brings us to the sponsor of today's video, Abacus AI. Because what they've built is a way around this problem. If you go to Abacus AI, you get access to all the top AI models in one place. Models like ChatGPT 5.4, Gemini 3.1 Pro, and Claude Opus 4.6. And instead of having to jump between tools and guessing which one is best, you can just use their Route LLM feature to automatically choose the best model depending on your prompt. And it's not just text either. You can generate images, videos, and full presentations. And there's even something called the Deep Agent, which creates apps, websites, softwares, and more. And the best part? This is all only $10 a month, which is a lot cheaper than paying for all these tools separately. If you're interested, you can check out Abacus using the link below or in the pinned comment. Thank you to Abacus AI for sponsoring this video. And now back to oil. Because if the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz is quietly giving the United States leverage in global trade, then now the question becomes, who is the biggest loser? And the answer to that is China. But this is also where it gets complicated, because China saw this risk coming, and they've spent years preparing for it. They've been actively diversifying suppliers, building strategic reserves, and expanding imports from other countries like Russia, Brazil, and Venezuela. But even though China has hedged themselves with safeguards to buy them time, they still haven't fully eliminated the risk, and they're still exposed. Because China is the largest importer of oil in the world. They consume around 15 to 16 million barrels per day, and roughly 11 million of those barrels are imported. And a huge portion of that comes from one region, the Middle East, flowing directly through the Strait of Hormuz, which means the safeguards they've built don't eliminate the risk, they just delay it. Because in the short term, China can probably absorb the shock. In the medium term, they start having to draw down on their reserves. But if the disruption lasts long enough, well, that's when the real problems begin. Where it goes from an inconvenience to a structural problem. And that's because China doesn't just use energy, it runs on it. From manufacturing to exports to their industrial output. The core of China's economy depends on a constant flow of energy, and when that flow gets disrupted, then the pressure builds. Which brings us to the part of the story that almost nobody seems to be talking about, and the main takeaway for this whole thing. Because if you zoom out for a second, something about this entire situation looks strange. Not the conflict itself, because conflicts happen all the time, especially in the Middle East, but the timing of it. Because right as tensions around the Strait of Hormuz started escalating, something else was happening. Trade negotiations between the United States and China were reaching a critical point. Whether it was tariffs, technology restrictions, or supply chain decoupling, for years, the economic and political relationship between the world's two largest economies has slowly been unraveling. And maybe that's where the truth in this conflict really is, because maybe negotiations are not just about finding a solution, maybe they're about leverage. And if that's true, well, leverage comes from pressure. Economic pressure, market pressure, and sometimes energy pressure. And when you start looking at the whole situation through that lens, the Strait of Hormuz stops looking like an energy story and starts looking like it may be a geopolitical story between China and the United States. Because if one country can tolerate the shock, while another country feels the structural pressure from it, then the shock itself becomes leverage. Which means maybe the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a choke point for oil, and maybe it's also a choke point for power.